Good. So we might make a start. Womanjeka, which is welcome in the country we're at the moment now, so I might want us to start with an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the land of the Wurundjeri people and the people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional custodians of this land. We acknowledge the care they've taken and continue to take on this land, and we pay respects to the elders past, present, and those so wonderfully to come in the future. Now, I want to preface this research presentation today with 4 questions which seem to underpin my engagement as a non-Indigenous Australian in a space where Indigenous Australians are the custodians of much of this landscape. It's their traditions and ways of knowing and the way we interact with that we'll be looking at today. I ask myself, where's my place? Where's my landscape? And how do I tread with soft padded feet? This is part of doctoral research. So I'm going to start with a story. Early in my doctorate studies, I had a problem. My supervisor wasn't able to secure me an Indigenous Australian co-supervisor, and I thought that was very important. Now, contact was made through the university with a couple of people, but no response was forthcoming. I knew that I couldn't directly go to see some of the people I wanted, but I then decided I found an Indigenous academic whose research seemed to pair with what I had, and I decided to send her an email. But I thought, how have I introduced myself on country to people with my story? So I gave them, in an email, the story of my engagement with Indigenous culture. Dear potential mentor, I approach you as a non-Indigenous doctoral student who's been lucky enough to have guidance and contact with many Indigenous people and communities. I ask myself, where's my place? Where's my landscape? What's my story? And how do I tread with soft padded feet? I was born in and respectfully acknowledge the homelands of the Turrbal, Jagera and Murray people in Queensland. After about 40,000 years living on that land and caring for it and telling their stories about country, in the 1820s, non-Indigenous people came and they stamped and tromped on that territory and created huge atrocities. I remember sometime in 1967 when my mum and me were going to King George Square in the centre of Brisbane, and we joined a rally for the 1967 referendum. I also recall going in 1970 with my mum to see Udguru Nunakal, she was called Kath Walker then, do a reading from her poetry book, We Are Going, in our back room in the Brisbane City Hall. I reminisce in 1972, seeing on television the tall figure, I can see it in my mind's eye, of Gough Whitlam, pouring the earth of Durungari soil into Vincent Lingari's hands in 1975 and say, we give it back. I reminisce in 1981 when I went to Griffith University and I, for the first time, found about the history of genocide, control boards, protectionism and assimilation policies and the stolen generation. And I remember a day in 1972 when a good friend of mine, Ben, for the first time, told me that he was Aboriginal. He was Coninbira. And I know he had trusted me with something very special. I can recall, during the 1980s, in the Edward Street Small Theatre in Brisbane, seeing The Cape Man, my first Indigenous play for the first time. Robert Merritt's Cape Man with Brian Siren and Justine Saunders in the cast. Later, I saw many other plays, including Jack Davis's The Dreamers. I've now seen over 130 Indigenous Australian plays in performance by theatre makers from over 25 different nations throughout our country. When I was studying down the road in 1986 at Victorian College of the Arts, theatre directing, I was lucky enough to work with Indigenous playwright Jack Davis's No Sugar when it came to the Fitzroy Town Hall. I'd seen a flyer and I just decided I'd go up to the Town Hall, and soon I found myself involved with that. And they invited me also to work on a drama too on the conference that was coming in the next year, the first National Black Playwrights Conference, it was called there. And I worked with Bob Mazza and Ernie Dingo with young playwrights to create plays about Indigenous stories. The group included Bob Mazza, Ernie Dingo, Justine Saunders, Lillian Miller, Rhoda Roberts, and Vivian Walker, the son of Kath Walker, who died a few years after that. I remember joining the 1988 protests against the invasion, the bicentenary. In 1989, I moved back to Brisbane, finished my Bachelor of Arts, and I was lucky enough to be in the same class as Wesley Enoch. We worked many years, we worked in a little Canadian troupe together, Bonzani, and we worked together. We talked a lot about his dreams for a new Indigenous theatre. In the 1990s, it was a golden age for Indigenous theatre. Plays such as Brand New Day, Seven Stages of Grieving, Conversations with the Dead. I started to take notes on every single production I saw, and I completed my Masters at the University of Melbourne. I did put some areas of that Indigenous dramaturgy into that, but I felt as if something was lacking. I went overseas in 1999 to pay the mortgage, but every year would come back and see Indigenous plays, and by 2010 I put together a book called Australian Indigenous Drama. I enclose to you my potential mentor, my potential for my research. I hope that you accept mentoring me in this, and I hope to tread on this landscape with respect, mindfulness. I hope to see the ground that I tread on and respect those people and cultures whose knowledge and ways of knowing and traditions have looked after this land for over 120,000 generations. Sincerely, Mark. I was happily rewarded when she agreed to be my supervisor. So, what is research? It starts with an abstract. This is an ethnographic study with the purpose to investigate how non-Indigenous teachers see and engage with an Australian Indigenous text. I'm identifying the ways of seeing within that, and it highlights my major research question. How do non-Indigenous secondary drama teachers engage with an Indigenous Australian drama text, and with what effects on their way of seeing that develop knowledge and understanding? In this ethnographic study, the case study research is to examine how 4 Victorian secondary drama teachers interacted with a text, The Seven Stages of Grieving. I did it through in-depth interviews, those teachers keeping visual diaries, and also having a forum with those teachers. Now, the significance of this research lies in its contribution to knowledge about social, cultural, and political issues surrounding the way that non-Indigenous teachers engage with Indigenous ways of knowing. Initially, there were 4 voices in this research. The Australian National Curriculum mandates that Australian teachers must teach Indigenous perspectives across all learning areas. An Australian government review said the emphasis on our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literature is criticised for undervaluing Australian literature. We are persuaded that there is a danger that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge, culture and heritage is being treated in a tokenistic and superficial manner. One thing that I won't mention in that script, they also said that they don't see that there's much value or ever has been any value in Indigenous Australian literature. Non-Indigenous academics said that teachers struggle to identify and teach Indigenous perspectives and knowledges. And finally, the voice that wasn't included in any of this, Indigenous Australian academics. They've stated there is an injustice in this embedding of Aboriginal perspectives for non-Aboriginal teachers. They're expected to do something that nobody has shown them how to do. There's plenty of research, there's plenty of training around what it is and why it is important. But there's very little about how to do it. As a researcher, I saw that the Australian National Curriculum requires us to teach Indigenous subject matter in a cross-curricular priority, something that teachers struggle with all the time. So the conundrum of the shape of doing this. With all this in mind, I investigated how non-Indigenous teachers teach Indigenous subject matter using an Indigenous model by Yanka Porter. There's 8 stages of cultural interface. These stages include the story, the map, the silence, the signs, the land, the shape, the backtracking, and the homeworld. My 3 research questions were: how do Victorian secondary teachers see an Indigenous text as an opportunity for theatrical exploration? How do Victorian secondary drama teachers visualise that text towards a greater understanding of knowledge? And how do Victorian secondary drama teachers turn or translate their interpretations into practical formats? I looked at much literature in all these different areas. I'll get a bit more quickly through this. You may want to think about these questions and what I've said there. Where were you born? What did 1967 referendum really mean? What people and places have you got connections to? What are some of the Indigenous plays, the ceremonies you've seen? 120 generations of Indigenous knowing on this land. And how do you tread with soft padded feet? I'll skip through a little bit. Actually, I'll just tell you 3 bits of research which are important in Indigenous ways. Okay. Nerita Blair's book, Australian Pedagogies, Privileging Australian Indigenous Knowledges, she says that quite often we fall into a hybrid zone. We're not teaching things the Indigenous way or the white way, and we feel confused by that. And she does set that up as something that we've got to address. Smith said that visual regimes of colonisation are there in everything we do. It's with how and where we position our knowledge and knowledge base. I also, within this research, use visual methodologies. Yanka Porter, who I mentioned, Blair, another Indigenous. Bawaka, which is one of the authors of this study. Bawaka is the land that takes place. And Bawaka says our understanding of space and place has to be about human knowledges and more than human knowings, and how to include Rawaka, which is the land where that research took place, into our ways of knowing. How do we include that? Foley, who talks about Indigenous Australian standpoint theory, and Casey, who's done so much work on Indigenous stories, talks about maybe we don't have a map of Australia. Maybe we have a story maps, linking the land communities and histories in a form that's visual and verbal mapping. And it's right there. I use the lenses of visuality. Paul's reception theory, the coding and decoding. Jay's idea of what is our scopic regime. Foucault's idea of heterotopias, spaces that are unreal, that seem to be spaces in themselves. And Smith's idea of visual regimes of colonisation. Okay. Might move straight on to the research and some of the voices in that research. Might have the 4 participants come up now, if that's okay. Choose a chair where you want to sit. Okay, in this scene, the findings are revealed of my research using Underquarter's 8 stages of engagement and cultural interface. The story, the map, the silence, the signs, the land, the shape, the backtracking, and the homeworld. The story. Alison. Alison is a 48-year-old non-Indigenous drama teacher. For her, the story of engagement with Indigenous Australian culture and perspectives started at university. Yeah.
I was quite horrified when I was 19 and went to university and discovered that wells were poisoned and all of these things add up. At first, I didn't believe it. They are not my ancestors after more discovery. And research, I found it was right. I was horrified.
The story for Bernadette.
So 2 of the things I've studied in my life have been sociology and politics. So I'm quite interested in social structures, and I've spent some time in my life in Indigenous communities. My school has a few connections with Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory. I think that one of the other things in terms of story is that I'm interested in feminism, and I am interested in the personal as political and the political as personal.
The story for Corey.
So, I'll start with the rituals. More ancient Aboriginal culture and work my way up into the history. And the more modern history. I was quite familiar with the modern history, modern Aboriginal stories. It's so out of my comfort zone. I'll start with the ritual stuff first.
The story for David.
I teach theatre studies, drama and English, and I have taught 13 Aboriginal plays all up. Part of the story which I wanted to tell to students was to set the scene with the initial work and give a background. I gave them a background to pre-colonial history of Aboriginal people. I then wanted to point out what happened during the frontier wars.
The map. For Alison, studying Indigenous plays in drama are vital signposts on the map of her learning journey.
But we are in Wurundjeri land, and what do you know about Aboriginal culture? Who do you actually know? What about here? On this land here? What do you know about here?
The map for Bernadette.
It's big and it's like a tornado. Like a tornado. And I suppose each time we came back to a scene, so that circular movement of going through a scene and going somewhere else and coming back to that scene, the visual of taking a child, the metaphor of the pebble, of taking a child out of its community, and placing it somewhere else gave us such a sense of what is at the heart of the stolen generation.
The map for Corey.
Oh, I think definitely a painting would be the best way to map it, yeah, with a bit of everything. I liken it to a painting I saw. It was a picture of how the, yams, and there's this central picture of a kind of circular drawings, and it looks like a Western desert concept map.
What is the map for David?
I like the idea of creating a map to describe my journey to the 7 stages of grieving. So I begin with the history and what is known and what is around me. That's the first sign of the post. I make sure that I don't just try to portray Aboriginal culture as in the past. I use the map differently. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their homelands with my students. I put it up in the drama room, and I've often found the students often looking at it and being amazed and working out where people were and what was in their homeland.
Silence. Alison. Silence for Alison is she feels non-Indigenous Australians create an Indigenous Australian culture and peoples around them, separate. Alison seems struck by the non-verbal aspects of performance, such as the interaction of the Indigenous Australian actress Shamash Damar with projected imagery.
So, the sign or the image, or the ideas which were really striking to me and my students, was the idea of not having a voice. And there are letters and words which were put up on the actress and shape her identity, or try to shape her identity, but then the wonderful thing about this play is that she shines through that.
Silence for Bernadette.
Then the actor came out and created that